What's up everybody? Tom coming at you guys with another requested video, and today's video is going to be over king mackerel fishing. It's going to kind of be on the way that I approach it. Today I'm going to go over reels, lines, rod, leaders, and lures. I'm not going to spend too much time on the reels, rods, and line, but I will spend more time on the leader and lures and kind of explain how I go about fishing those specific things and when to use specific techniques. It's worked for me. Before we get into that though, real quick, I am up in Texas. If you guys haven't known, I've talked about it a little bit in past videos, but we got hit pretty hard with this snowstorm. So it kind of pushed the timeline of when those cobia jigs are going to be coming out. I know I've had some people hit me up asking about them, but I am working on them. Kind of just got set back. I was going to try to get a lot of it knocked out the last weekend. This 2 weekends ago, I guess. Now I'm all thrown off with everything that's been going on. But unfortunately, we got hit with that. Power went out. We had to leave town. But everything's back. We're back. We're good. We're going. I'm going to start working on those and get those done and ready for you guys. Hopefully within the next 2 weeks or so. If you're not following the Facebook page, go ahead and check that out. And that's where all that stuff will be posted. All right, guys, so let's go ahead and get into this. So, talking reels, I recommend the same exact reels that I talked about in my last video when I was talking about cobia fishing gear. I'd say, you know, starting from the bottom, working up, a Mitchell 302, Penn 706, Van Staal. I mean, you don't even need a 250. The only reason I say 250 is because those reels are all reels that you can buy and fish for multiple fish species. So if I'm approaching buying a new setup or something, I want to get something that I can fish with, you know, mackerel, king mackerel, cobia, tarpon, you know, redfish, whatever you want to go after on the pier. I would just say go one of those routes with one of those reels. Obviously, the reason I said at the beginning of this video that I'm not going to go down too much of a wormhole with the reels, rods, and line is just because you can get away with a lot more king mackerel fishing. They're not a fish that's going to dig on you typically. They're not going to shoot the pier. They will shoot the pier sometimes, but they're not. It's not an up and down fight most of the time. You're going to hook them. You're going to have your drag not too tight. You're going to have to where that fish is going to run out. You're going to reel it in. They might make a couple runs, and you're going to bring them into the pier. Most of the time, they're pretty worn out when you bring them in anyways. So it's not a super hard up and down fight typically. Sometimes those bigger fish, yes, it will be like that. Once you get them up, they might fight a little bit harder, but typically it's not going to be anything that you need super beefed up gear to catch king mackerel. That's why the rods and reels and all that stuff it's kind of open for interpretation, because you don't need anything super specific for them, because you can get away with a lot more. So those are the 3 reels that I recommend, because like I said, you can take them and fish with any other type of fish off the pier typically, or for the most part. All right, so let's go ahead and talk about line. Line is something I'll spend a little bit more time on. So obviously you can go monofilament or braid. I guess you could go fluorocarbon, but I've never used fluorocarbon for pier fishing, and I don't think you really need it. It's kind of more money than what you need unless you're using it for a leader or something like that. So I don't recommend it for a main line. I know there are a lot of good lines out there, but I don't think you need to go that route. So monofilament, I would say anywhere between, you could bump it down to 12 pound if you want. So I'd say anywhere between 12 and 25 if you like. I know some guys that'll run 25 in the spring just in case they end up hooking a cobia while they're snobbling a bait off the pier. But most guys you're going to see between 15 and 20 pound monofilament if they're running mono. And then braid, same thing. I've actually caught a mackerel in like real late fall, almost winter time, on like 8 pound braid before, but I wouldn't recommend using 8 pound braid. I'd say anywhere between, if you're gonna have a rod just set up for mackerel, I'd say 15 pound to 40 pound. Like I said before in past videos, I run 40 on pretty much everything that I fish. So that's typically what I'll throw, just because it's a good diameter, it's strong. Also, if you want to fish for something else, you don't have to worry about, oh, I don't have a heavy enough line. So I'd say 30 or 40 really, to be more specific. But 40 if you just want something to fish all the time. But anywhere between 15 and 40. You don't really want to go to 50 because it gets thicker and it gets a little bit harder to throw once the wind picks up, and you just don't want to deal with that. All right, guys, let's go ahead and talk about rods real quick. So rods, same thing. You don't need anything with a whole lot of backbone. If you're not interested in cobia fishing or anything, I would say go ahead and get a glass rod, just because it's got a way better bend to it. It's a little bit sloppier, but it's typically easier to throw baits for some reason with that action, that like medium action, sloppier style rod. It just slings baits for some reason. And like I said, you don't need a super big backbone. So you can get away with a lot more. And those glass rods are really good for fighting fish that just run, because they're gonna be fighting the rod the most of the time. You're not gonna be having to fight the rod. You pretty much set it in your hip and let them go. Once they stop, work on them, get them in. All dependent on your style of how you like fishing. But like I said before, and I'll say it again, is my personal opinion is Rain Shadow 1088. Can't go wrong with it. If you want to get a rod to do anything and everything, I would say that rod. That rod throws baits well. It throws big baits well, and you can catch any fish you want to off the pier with it, essentially. So I recommend that if you're going to get a rod built. All right, guys. So we talked about the reels, the lines, and the rods. I know I didn't get real specific with it because, like I said, you don't need to. But this is where I want to talk about and get more in depth with it. Is going to be like the swivels, the leaders, not really the swivels, but the leaders and the different presentations. So I'll break it down into 3 different groupings, and I like to use these in specific times, at specific times. So first thing is throwing a bait, and you can kind of break that into 2 subsections, which is going to be a live bait or a dead bait. Typically you want a live bait. Sometimes it gets kind of hard to fish a live bait, especially when there's a lot of people out there and your bait's just swimming all over the place. You don't want to be that guy that's having your bait swim over people, getting tangled up with everybody. So you pick your poison on that. But with that, let's go ahead and talk about a leader. I prefer 7-strand leader. It doesn't have to be the brand 7-strand. There's a couple different brands that make a good leader, but 7-strand is a good brand. But I use 60-pound. Use about 2.5 foot leader. The reason I use 60 is I used to use 40. I used it for about probably a year and a half, 2 years when I first started out, and I didn't have any issues with it. But then I got cut off twice. Once I know it was a Spanish, I saw it come up and eat, and it clipped my leader, cut it right in half, and then I've been clipped off again by, I think it was a king mackerel. I didn't see that fish very well, but I know for sure one was a Spanish. I was like, there's no reason a Spanish mackerel should be cutting my 40-pound leader, and then being cut off before. And another thing too is if you're fishing leaders, you're bound at some time to have a shark come up and eat your bait, whether you're intending to catch it or not. And if you don't just break them off right away and you want to fight that fish, 40, if you hook one of those 5-6 foot spinners or black tips out there and they don't break you off and you're fighting it for a while, they will fray through 40. 60 typically holds up. If you're fighting it with 15-pound mono and you're fighting it for an hour, it's most likely going to chew through it, but 60 will hold up pretty well. So I bumped up to 60 and I haven't had any issues with it, and I highly recommend using 60. I hate seeing guys out there, I got clipped off. What are you using, 27-pound? Well, that's your issue. No, it slides in between it. That's a bunch of bullshit. I'm going to tell you guys right now. Do not use 27-pound 7-string. I saw the biggest mackerel of my life I've ever seen on the pier eat almost at my feet. This guy beside me. And he went to set the hook. He was using 27-pound, and it cut right away. I would hate for one of you guys to be fishing with 27-pound leader, thinking it's going to be okay. It's just going to slide in between their teeth or whatever people think happens, and you get cut off and broken off right away, or you lose that fish because you're fishing 27-pound leader. Especially when you're fishing braid. You're fishing 40-pound braid and you're putting a little bit more pressure, and there's no stretch with that. It's putting so much more pressure on that leader. You got to think about that. So, throwing a bait, 60-pound 7-string leader. That's what I recommend. Size 1, size 2, even a 1/0 hook, depending on the size bait. If you're throwing those big hardtails or ladyfish or something like that, I would definitely use like a 1/0. And then swivel, I'd recommend, I told you guys I like Spro swivel. It's just what I use. But I think this is like a 120-pound. I'd just say like 80-pound and up is pretty good. I typically, if I'm buying swivels just for tying leaders, I typically get 80 is what I usually do. Some of these were just tied because this is just what I had at the time, and I didn't go out and buy more. I just had them in the house. So I went ahead and just tied up these leaders with these. I believe these are 120-pound swivels. Yes, so there's 2 other methods, and before we get in those, I just want to say, like, throwing a bait is personally my favorite way of catching mackerel. I just think it's super cool, super interactive when you're snobbling a bait, especially when they come up and, you know, they'll cut it sometimes, they'll circle back and eat it, or, you know, they just might blow up on it, whatever they do. I think it's really cool being able to free spool, watch that fish eat that bait, and then put it on the manual and set the hook. That's my favorite way of doing it. But I think there's some times where these other methods shine really well. So the other methods are going to be doing some sort of like jerkbait style, so like an X-Wrap or a bomber. And the last method I'll talk about is throwing like a crippled herring or a diamond jig or something along those lines. So I like throwing these. Sometimes I just like throwing these over a bait, just whenever I feel like doing it. Or if I see that there's a lot of fish around, they're being super aggressive. Sometimes I like throwing these, give them something moving a little bit faster, maybe a little bit more flash than whatever bait I'm throwing, something a little bit different. Or if there's a lot of people catching them on lures, sometimes it's fun to just catch them on lure. Real quick, so if you guys don't want to go spend the 20-something on this lure, I actually picked this one up whenever I was in Florida back in November. These things are like $7 at Walmart. These bombers are killer. I caught a king mackerel in December on one of these damn things. These lures are awesome, and they're cheap, so if you lose them, it's not that big of a deal. I know there's a bunch of guys that'll like strip these down and spray paint them just all white, whatever you want to do. But yeah, if you want to get into lures and not spend too much money, see if it's something you want to do, I highly recommend getting some of these bombers. They're good, and they come with pretty decent hooks on them. Alright, so these, excuse me, so these, like I said, another time that I'll pick this up is when the wind's blowing a little hard, like, so maybe all I have is like thread fins or something. If you guys know, if you're fishing even like a 10-mile-an-hour wind and higher, it can get hard throwing those thread fins. They just catch the wind and kind of want to fall down. You can pick one of these up and throw it, and you can get it out there a lot further. And I really like the action of these. And you can fish these subsurface, just, you know, maybe a few inches to a foot underneath the water, and just got a really good action. So what I want to talk about too, real quick, swivels, same thing, 80 and up. You don't need like a 200-pound swivel or anything like that, but I'd say 80 to 150 pound would be perfectly fine. But the leader, I actually have a lighter leader than I'm going to recommend on here right now. But with these lures, something you got to think about, and you can kind of see how I tied that it's a little bit different than I typically tie my leaders like these. Also, I have a video, I'll link it up for you guys to go see if you want to, of how I tie my 7-strand leaders. But with these, when you're throwing these with this weight, over time this knot starts cinching down and cinching and cinching and cinching. I've kind of looped this and tied it a little bit different. The reason I did this is because this is lighter leader than I'd recommend using, and I didn't have any with me, so I went ahead and tied this specific knot. If you guys want me to make a future video on how to tie this, go ahead and comment below and I will. But what I recommend when you bump up to one of these, especially when you bump up to these, is bump your leader up to like 90 pound. I know that sounds kind of ridiculous, but it's gonna save your lures, because this leader, as you're throwing and pulling and throwing and pulling, it cinches down, and it happens with any sort of leader, and it's gonna get tight, and over time, it's at one point, it might be 2 or 3 days down of fishing before it happens, but you're gonna go to throw, and your lure's just gonna go, and it's just gonna break right at that knot. So I do recommend bumping up to like 90 pound. You're fishing these pretty fast. These fish aren't gonna come up and look at it. Most of the fish that you get that eat these lures are just gonna come in and smoke it, or they'll fall up behind and then come up and eat it. So most likely they're not gonna see it. I've never had any issues with it, but it might save you a $25 lure. So just keep that in mind. Let's go ahead and talk about the last presentation that I like. So I really like this one when the wind is ripping. So something you'll notice when the wind is blowing really hard, you'll see a lot of mackerel skying. And that's typically because the baits are being pulled across the surface pretty quickly. And sometimes I think they just see it real quick, and it's so blurry because the water's moving, they just kind of come up and blow up on it. But I like throwing something like this. One, because you can throw it in the wind and it's going to launch out there. This, or I say like a diamond jig, will work pretty well as well also. And just burn it to where it's just bouncing right on top and making like it almost looks like a ballyhoo. If you've ever seen ballyhoo run from bait, just kind of trying to imitate that, where it's just popping on top and they're gonna sky on it. That's whenever I really like throwing this sort of lure. And once again with this, you can bump this up even to like 150 pound 7-strand if you want. They're not gonna see the leader, they're literally just gonna see this and blow up on it on top of the water. And swivels, same thing, 80 pound and up. You can bump it up if you want. This is gonna be a solely, I'm not gonna say solely, it's gonna be a topwater bait, but 99% of the time you're gonna throw this and just burn it across the top. All right, guys, so I know I kind of covered stuff pretty quickly. I covered the gear and lures, all that sort of stuff. I wanna talk about a few more things before we wrap this video up. So, a couple things to think about is typically in the Gulf, you'll catch mackerel when the water's a little dingy, but most of the time they like a clear water and rough water. So you want like a south, southeast, even southwest, or even a strong northeast or straight east wind is really good for mackerel. You really want that chop on the water. You're gonna bring them in. Some things to look for. So these are a couple pro tips. I like to call pro tips. But springtime, if you're realizing, you're noticing that these fish are being hooked on the side of the pier, leave the end of the pier and go about halfway, maybe 3/4 of the way down, and fish for them. A lot of times in the spring, those king mackerel will get right up on the bar, and they'll hit the bar and go up the side of the pier. If you can find where those fish are coming in, or just a little bit above them, you can sit there and catch fish all day, and you can pick fish out. Typically there's huge, I'm talking like 30 pound plus mackerel coming down the bar, and you can pretty much pick them out however you want. So that's a little tip for springtime fishing, is looking more inshore. Don't always focus out on the end. See, a lot of guys, it's usually where it gets hectic, especially when the fish are going off. There can be a lot of people out there, but springtime especially, you can fish shallower and have a lot better chance of catching fish. So just keep that in mind when you're out there fishing for these mackerel. Also, I think it goes without saying that if there's bait around, I would fish with the bait that's there. If for some reason you can't catch the bait or the bait's moving pretty quickly, I just recommend something super shiny. I like thread fins, ballyhoos. Cigar minnows are great. Everybody loves cigar minnows, but sometimes I like to stand out a little bit, throwing that more flashy bait. But if there's a certain bait around, use that. And don't always think that you have to use the biggest bait around. I caught my biggest mackerel. It was 35 pounds on a hardtail, like no lie, it was that big. So just keep those things in mind. Like I said, guys, this was a quick video, kind of just ran through this stuff, kind of sat down, pushed record, and went after it. So if there's anything I missed or any questions that you guys have, just go ahead, comment below, and I'll answer it either in the comments or I'll make a future video on it. And if you guys have any other requests, anything else, go ahead and I'll make a video on it. I just want to say thank you to Krister Go, who was the one who commented asking for this video. Thanks for the idea. I hope this helped you out. And until next time, guys, y'all take it easy.